Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session. I will be your speaker for today, and as you will see from the screen on front of you, my name is Andrew Coyle, and the topic for today's presentation is Enhance Your Information Security Strategy with ISO 27001. At the end of this presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So you will have the opportunity to send in some questions through either the chat box application as well as a question bar, which you should be able to see from your screen. So, enhancing your strategy with 27001. What we are going to cover in the presentation is trying to put a context on why information security is important nowadays. We'll then start to look at the fundamentals and elements that we would need to consider when we are implementing an information security strategy. Third topic I want to discuss are really just the key areas of concern and why and how ISO 27001 could assist you in addressing some of the issues. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the challenges in both the cybersecurity space as well as implementing an ISO 27001 management system. So really, as everyone will be aware, over the last few years, there has been a massive improvement on how information and data is being used. Initially, when the standards were first introduced, the main concern was on PC, personal computers, and laptops. But now, over the last few years, there's been a significant rise, and people are now using laptops and smartphones to access information and data. A lot of the applications that are now available, especially those that are used for making payments or transferring information from point A to point B, are all more easily accessible to potential hackers. The fact that there is also a large movement into the cloud environment is also a concern. Business models have changed again over the last few years, the last 5 or 6 years. So not everyone is working individually or working in isolation. There's more evidence now and more obvious use of shared workspaces, maintaining franchise models. So because of that, we're required to have an increased focus on cybersecurity and what we need to do to make sure that we continue to maintain safety of our data and our information. Some of the facts that we want to bring together is of the breaches that were reported in 2018, 65% of large firms that were sampled confirmed that they detected a breach within 2018. 25% of those firms claimed or made a statement that they were being breached at least monthly, that this was a regular occurrence. Of small to medium enterprises, 75% of these were estimated to have been breached. So you can see there's a significant effort from cyber hackers trying to attack organizations. Of the small to medium enterprises that were sampled, roughly 25% of them were saying that they agree that security was a top priority. But making security a top priority doesn't necessarily mean that they will have sufficient controls. It's just a good indicator that they are aware of it. But if we read the other way around, 75% of small, medium enterprises don't see security as a priority. And that's the worrying trend. Yeah, data is valuable. Data and information is valuable to many people. You will be aware of your own requirements and those of your clients, but you also need to be aware that potential hackers, potential cyber crime criminals are also looking for data. We've seen numerous occasions in the news and the press where information has been stolen and then sold on to generate revenue income for someone else. On average, what we are finding is it's roughly 100 days after the event before organizations realize or discover they've been hacked. So they've had 100 days worth of time to get away with the hack that they've done. Recently, the UK introduced a piece of legislation called GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regulations. Now, this was introduced in late May of 2018, and for European organizations where this regulation is in place, it now stipulates a fine, which is the maximum fine can be a percentage of the global turnover. So for small, large organizations, this can be quite a hefty financial penalty. So if you do require to comply with this general data protection regulation, then you have to notify the regulator within a certain period of time. And if you do not, you will be fined, you will be penalized. So since the introduction of GDPR certainly into Europe and with any other organization based either here in Asia who have a presence within the EU, the European community, the GDPR regulation could apply to yourself, and now you could be liable to a quite significant fine if you did not report a breach. So certainly there's been more focus on the cybersecurity through Europe, and from my point of view, with my client base over here in South Asia, yeah, there is a bigger focus on cybersecurity rather than just data security. Some more worrying facts we need to be aware of. The Target department store network, hackers get into their system via the air conditioning network, and it was quite simply because an alert had not been switched on. Another element, when hackers maintained access into Sony, they had such control that they could massively download huge amounts of data quite quickly before being seen. Equifax, the credit agency, they lost 60 million credit reports because one person did not update a server. So you see where hackers are getting smart, hackers are beginning to target, and when they get in, they have access to large amounts of either data, information which could be used to extort money from various parties. A recent report for certainly 2016 showed that whilst there is still a significant amount of hacking taking place, ransomware is no longer the number one priority. Crypto mining has had a massive increase over that period. And although ransomware infections, as you see on the screen, reduced by 30% over the year, crypto mining infections had actually increased by nearly 45%. And for those who are not quite aware of what crypto mining is, it's really just a software to be able to mine cryptocurrency without the user's explicit permission. So we've all heard of Bitcoin and the same nature. Hackers are now looking at being able to take information without having to place an organization at ransom. Healthcare and finance still maintain their number one, number two targets, obviously because of the nature of the information and the type of information that these two sectors maintain. They are still the top targets for hackers. As part of my daily involvement with organizations on information security and carrying out audits against the 27001 standard for security, a lot of these statements on the screen I've heard numerous occasions. Oh yeah, nobody will hack us because we're too small. Nobody's too small. Information, any information. You may define yourself as a small to medium enterprise, but would your clients be happy if information on them were lost or stolen? Similarly, normal response is, yeah, we don't think we have any valuable data. Data and the value of data will change from one person to another. Your interpretation of what is valuable may differ from, again, your client's interpretation of what's data. You may think it's low risk, but it may not be low risk to someone else. Another one is, yeah, we don't process credit card data. So because we're not managing credit cards, there's no valuable information such as credit card numbers and bank details. That's certainly one area, but it's not necessarily the biggest focus on data mining, data theft. Some of the others, yeah, we bought a nice expensive flashing box. Yeah, but you do need to make sure that if you do buy these super duper systems, that someone is actually monitoring, someone is looking at it. Don't just because assume because you've paid good money to buy a software or a defense system. Any management system, any system at all is basically dependent on the people who manage it, the people who run it. Humans are the weakest link, and every time we have conversations with clients, that's the focus that we make on is you need to make sure that if you have all these controls in place, that you have someone with a responsibility to make sure it's being applied, that it's being monitored. We'll come back over to that later when we talk about ISO 27001 and its basic principle of following a plan, do, check, act process. The fact that nothing has gone wrong before doesn't necessarily mean nothing will go wrong in the future. So being complacent, again, is a big issue, especially when we're looking at how organizations use the information which 27001 can produce. You need to monitor it, you need to evaluate it, you need to check it, you need to compare it against this week to last month to last year. It's not just an instantaneous control. We need to be aware of what's happening. So the fact that nothing's gone wrong before doesn't necessarily mean it will not go wrong again in the future. And we need to continually test. The fact you've done a test 4 or 5 years ago and everything was fixed then, that was 4 or 5 years ago. Things change on a daily basis. You need to make sure that you're monitoring. You need to make sure you're constantly updating. And again, that's one of the benefits that having a formal management system in place will achieve that. ISO 27001, if you follow it, requires that you do monitor. It requires that you do keep yourself up to date. You need to make sure that you are on top of everything that you can be. Hackers are smart people. They know what they do. Most organizations only realize they've been hacked after the case, where 27001, when you implement it, will be asking you to try and be more proactive. It's expecting you to be proactive. You need to demonstrate that you do have resources to be able to monitor the situation, be aware of any hacks, breaches, vulnerabilities, and then put steps in place to address them. So 27001 assists the organization to be very proactive and not just waiting and react to what has happened. As we all appreciate, once that has happened, it's too late. You cannot go back and fix it, but we have to make sure that if it does happen to us, we do everything in our power to stop it happening again. So 27001. Well, 27001 is the international standard for information security. It was released reissued, in 2013. It was the first management standard to follow the Annex SL requirement that all the recent other standards for quality, safety, and environment, which have been reissued in the last 2 years, all management standards now follow the same methodology. They will follow the same structure, which makes it easier for integrated systems to come together. But ISO 27001 was the very first management system standard to follow the 10 clauses for those who are aware of the Annex SL requirement. Like every international standard, it is a set of good practices. Any ISO 27001, ISO 9001, 14001 for environment, they will not tell you what to do. What they do is tell you what areas you should consider. And that's where the standards come in. These are the good practices. Every time a standard is revised and reissued, which tends to be on a 7-8 year cycle, they very rarely add anything new to the standard, but what they are doing is adopting and adapting itself to the industries that are using it. The best practices are now available rather than the best practices which were available 7-8 years prior. So as I said earlier, that if we implement 27001, we have to make sure that we continually monitor the situation both internally and external. Be aware of vulnerabilities, be aware of technical threats that are coming through, and the standards are doing exactly the same. They will update themselves regularly to make sure that they reflect the needs of you, the organizations who will apply the standard. So as you see on the screen, it is a series of information security best practices. They ask you to adopt a risk-based approach, to manage risks, to be able to identify threats and vulnerabilities, and put actions in place to address them. It asks that you emphasize training and awareness. So make sure people are trained in what can happen, what their expectations are, but also make them aware. It's very common that I will go into an organization and they will show me lots of paper, lots of records to demonstrate that people have been trained. But that isn't enough. You need to make sure that people understand why the training is there. Not just tell them what to do, but explain to them why. Because we have certainly found when we go into an organization, if an employee is aware of why the control is in place, they are more likely to apply the control. If they are just working because they have been told to do this, they do not think about why they're doing it. They do not realize the repercussions of not following it. So training and awareness are both equally important. And making your employees, your staff aware of why we're asking them to maintain these controls, why we're asking them not to let family members use work assets, laptops or tablets, so that they cannot introduce other viruses, so that they cannot mistakenly allow family members or other people to access information which is limited to the organization. So making people aware of the controls is one of the big focuses that all of the management system standards do. And the fourth bullet point on the screen, as I said earlier, you do need to make sure you monitor and measure what is happening. You can put all the controls in place, write them into policies and procedures, and then issue them. But if people do not apply them, they're of no benefit. So ISO 27001 requires that you will monitor and make sure policies and procedures are being applied. You'll make sure people understand why they apply, make sure they understand how they apply. So this is all part of any management system standard, and 27001 is no different. The difference that 27001 does have that the other management system standards do not have is at the end of 27001, there is an Annex A. Now, Annex A is optional. There are 114 controls listed here, and this is where ISO 27001 identifies the good practices stated above. So the 144 controls are broken down into different areas: asset management, human resource management for onboarding and offboarding of people, looking at development activities, looking at business continuity, looking at IT acquisitions, supplier vendor managements. So they're split into various sections. But of the 114 controls that are listed, we realize that not every organization will need to apply the 114. So if there is a requirement, and a common one for small organizations is cryptology, there may be no requirement to encrypt any information because of the nature of the information that you are dealing with. And perhaps your clients either do not require it, or perhaps what is quite often, they do not have the capability to unencrypt information. So that may be an area that could be excluded. And certainly ISO 27001 does allow you to exclude one of any of these Annex A controls, so long as it is justifiable. It is not acceptable to exclude a control because it's too difficult. It has to be excluded because there is no need for that control within your organization or within your client's expectations. So of the 114 controls, the standard will ask you to look at each of these and produce a document called a statement of applicability. And that statement of applicability document is primarily those 114 controls listed. And quite simply, as the name suggests, it states whether that control is applicable to your organization or is not. If it does apply, then the document would require and request you to make a statement as to how it is applied, whether that be a link to an existing policy or perhaps just some text into the document itself to explain how it is applied within your organization. And conversely, if there's a control which is not applicable, you must justify why the control is not applicable to your organization. And the statement of applicability is the simplest and most effective document to be able to clearly state to everyone what does and what does not apply and why. ISO 27001 is the international standard. As its name suggests, ISO is actually the International Organization for Standardization, and 27001 is the standard which is applied globally. I personally have been involved in information security audits from Europe, Australia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, and every organization, every client I have visited, they are using the same standard. It will be translated into various languages to suit the country it's applicable to, but the content is always identical. So what it does is it gives a level of confidence to both clients and also your own personnel that if you go to an organization who hold and have 27001, the perception is they know they have controls. They will be expected to monitor, they will be expected to validate and verify that what they say they do, they actually do carry out. So it provides this level of confidence to other organizations that if you utilize our organization to manage or manipulate data belonging to yourself, that it will not be misused. It will not be taken out of context. It will be maintained with a level of confidentiality. And that's one of the drivers for 27001, to be able to provide this level of confidence to your clients that you do know what you're doing, that you are aware of the information that you are holding on their behalf. And from an internal point of view, also make sure that you control your own information. You will hold information on your staff. Every organization holds names, addresses, dates of birth, bank details for payment of salaries. That's very useful information to a hacker. So as an internal mechanism, it makes sure that you do implement good practice, but it's a good indicator for clients that they should be able to do business with yourself with a higher level of confidence that any information that they give you as part of your operations will not be misused, will not be abused. Three main principles that ISO 27001 brings in are showing on the screen there. So the three key principles are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we show the diagram as a scale, a set of scales, because if you think about it, confidentiality, in the definition that ISO 27001 puts on confidentiality is information should not be made available to unauthorized individuals, entities, or processes. So information should only be made available to those people, to those organizations, and even your internal processes that require it. Not everyone in your organization. Integrity, protecting the accuracy and the completeness of the data, the information, that it's truthful, it's not been modified, it's not been altered. And then availability, making sure that information is only accessible and used when required, upon demand, and by those people who are authorized to use it. So they are three cornerstones, and if each of those are in place, you should have very good control over the information you're handling. But if one of them is weak, if because of the confidential nature, you do make it available to people who do not need it, then you're failing to meet both the integrity and the availability. If it's available to everyone, how can it be confidential? You haven't distinguished or determined the difference between one set of data and the other, because everyone in your organization can access everything. That is not what 27001 is looking for you to achieve. So those three principles of confidentiality, integrity, and availability must be applied at all times. That will vary from organization to organization. So in some organizations, perhaps the integrity and availability of that information may be more important than the confidentiality. And there may also be conflicts if we make it confidential and restrict it too much because of the confidential nature, then perhaps it's not available to the people who need it. So it is a balance. It's not something which can quite simply apply to every organization. And this is a good example of where I said earlier that the standards are looking for you to adopt a risk-based approach. So you can have procedures and classifications of information set, but you need to apply it rationally. You need to make sure that the information does get to the people or the processes that need it. Because it may be classified as confidential or restricted, that status should not mean that people, processes who need it do not have access to it. So that's why the analogy of the scales, you have to weigh up, do we really make it so tight that nobody can access it? If we do that, then we may not be able to actually process the information correctly. So you can look at your own organization, and I'd like to think you would see the truth in that statement. It is very common when we assess an organization to 27001 that when they have policies and procedures, and one of them is information classification, that is one of the requirements of the Annex A of this standard, that you need to determine the classifications and then put the effective measures in place. Now, I mentioned earlier that 27001 doesn't tell you how to do it. All it would apply is of the 114 controls, these are controls that should apply, but each organization will implement these controls differently. Adopting a risk-based approach, you may follow ISO 31000 as a risk management process, but it's not required. The standards do not dictate that you must follow a specified additional standard. Other standards are available, other standards can be adopted, but the point I'm trying to bring out is that ISO 27001 will only ask that you need to manage risk. It will not tell you how to manage risk. And as an assessor, when we're looking at an organization, we just have to make sure that you are following a risk-based approach. But if I were to visit 5 different organizations in 5 consecutive days, all of which hold 27001 registration, I would not expect to see the same risk management process in every organization. That's just unrealistic. So it does give you the flexibility to make sure that for you to implement ISO 27001, you can adopt a risk-based approach that satisfies your organization, your needs, but also satisfies the needs and expectations of your clients and any other interested parties. So it's a balancing situation when we're looking at implementing 27001. When we become involved as a certification body, when we look at 27001, the key processes in the center of this diagram are usually well managed. It's the obvious areas that an organization first identifies as needing to be addressed within this information security standard. So they will look at the IT department, the technical side of it. They will identify their key processes. They will look at the facilities, the buildings, and all the utilities like power, um, light, emergency equipment, fire suppression systems. These are usually easily identified as in scope of 27001 because they're the technical elements. They're the key processes. But we can't just rely and focus on the center of the diagram. We need to be aware of the second light gray element. So the organization itself is registered, not just the technical team. It's not just the IT department that would be registered by ISO 27001. It's the organization that's registered. So other areas that now have to come into scope when you're determining what needs to be managed within my ISO 27001 system is the areas shown in red. So yeah, the human resource, people and culture team, they need to be part of this information security system because a requirement of Annex A is human resource management. You need to have controls in place for how you onboard people. It asks that you do screening process, background checks if applicable. So that's normally managed by the HR, people and culture team. Similarly, when someone leaves, when you're offboarding, there are controls within 27001 which will define what has to be addressed when people are leaving. So HR, critical element of the system. Legal, hopefully, again, fairly obviously, ISO 27001 requires that you will comply with any applied legal or regulatory requirements in your country or in your industry sector. So again, the legal function needs to be part of your scope. Finance, another key area because of the nature of the data and the information that they will hold. They will hold bank details of your vendors, your suppliers. So they would be a very useful area of your organization for a potential hacker to move in to get that information. By the same token, your administration team, they're the team which would generally hold your employees' data. So as I said earlier, names, addresses, bank account details, all of these have very useful information that a potential hacker could sell on. Marketing, why are marketing as critical as the others? Well, we see no reason why not. Marketing are the people who are going out and selling your organization. They need to be aware of the security requirements because if they're going out to promote your organization, they need to fully understand the risks involved in a new client coming over and having a relationship with yourself. So they are just as critical as finance, legal, HR. So they also have to be brought in. And those two inner circles primarily is what would be expected to be contained within the scope of your ISO 27001 management system. Now, the outer circle are external elements. So these are potential areas which could impact on your management system. So the first two internal are where you have control over those entities yourselves. The external purple ring with suppliers, insurance, and clients, they are out with your control, but they are people who may be reliant on your 27001 system. As we said, having a 27001 management system should provide this confidence to outside clients, vendors, of your ability to maintain the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of information that they may be asking you to use on their behalf. So you need to be aware of what information they will be giving you. You need to be aware of your suppliers and your vendors. If there is an activity which is being managed by a third party on your behalf, then the responsibility for that third party relies and stays with yourself. You need to make sure that your management system identifies what information a outside third party will access, making sure again that they only have access to what they want and what they need. Insurance companies and other customer satisfaction elements, again, these are good indicators of what your management system applies. Do you have adequate controls? If you have adequate controls, you should have happy, content suppliers. Your customer satisfaction figures should be positive, that you're not misusing information, you're not losing client data. So your management system is looking for both the internal controls as well as the external controls. Anyone who may be able to impact on your management system needs to be considered. So regulators, other third parties, key elements of 27001. So just to finish that slide, it's not just an audit or a management system for your IT department. It is always perceived that ISO 27001 is a technical standard. It is not. It is a management system, no different from quality, safety, or environment, but it does have an IT focus by the nature of it. But it's not sufficient just to concentrate on your IT team. You must make sure that the organization as a whole is considered, and you consider what risks there are to the organization from both internal and external factors. Two key elements that are core to ISO 27001 are making sure you understand and manage assets and risks. So I've mentioned risk earlier in the presentation. And ISO 27001 states that the definition of a risk is the effect of an uncertainty on objectives. So it states that information security risk needs to be associated with the potential that threats will exploit vulnerabilities of an information asset or a group of assets and thereby can cause harm to the organization. So an asset from the line above, again, the definition from a 27001 perspective is an asset is anything that has value to an organization. Now, the key assets and the obvious assets are physical assets, so your servers, laptops. These are very obvious, and every organization that we've assessed always has physical assets clearly identified in their asset register. But there are other assets. Bearing in mind the definition is anything that has a value to the organization. Key other intangible assets are your reputation. If you were hacked and information from a client were to be abused or used by a third party, how would your reputation be? Would you still survive? It doesn't make your organizational image look good if you have been able to have more than one security breach. So when you're producing your management system, you need to clearly make sure that when you think of asset, it is anything which is of value. People are an asset. The number of individuals, or think about the number of individuals in your organization who have all the knowledge. What happens if that person leaves? Do you then lose all that knowledge? There's a risk there. So widen your horizon away from the physical assets of laptops, mobile phones, tablets, servers. We need to be aware of anything else. So make sure you do address software, the programs, license agreements for software, making sure people only have access to what they need, making sure those software programs are updated, that any patches and any vulnerabilities that are identified are addressed. These are all expectations and areas that should and must be considered within your security management system. And once you've identified the asset, then you go into your risk review mode. You look at each asset and you determine what is the threat, what is and how vulnerable are we to that threat for that specific asset. So asset registers can run to small number of assets based on the size of the organization to pages. It isn't necessary to try and identify each individual asset. So if you're an organization, say the size of Lloyd's, now we want to identify laptops as an asset, we'll probably have something close to 10, 15,000 assets. Now, it'd be impractical to have a register with 15,000 individual assets on it, but that may be what's necessary for your organization. But you could rationalize those assets into laptops, into servers themselves, rather than break it down into each individual asset. But again, this is an example of where that would depend on each organization's risk profile. If you're a small organization, 15, 20 people, then you could quite easily produce an asset register which lists every single asset. But Sony, Lloyd's, Target that we showed earlier, that may be impractical. So the standard isn't dictating how you list assets. All the requirement will be from 27001 is that to be compliant, you must maintain an asset register. Now, if you have a CMDB in place, that can be used as your asset register. It need not be as complicated as a configuration database. It need not be an access file. It could be a very simple spreadsheet. All of those would be suitable and acceptable if you were being audited against that standard, because the requirement is quite simply from a 27001 point of view, you need to maintain an asset register. Simple as that. So again, just a potential register. You need to identify what is critical in your system. Because as I said a moment ago, you could end up with a register which is thousands of lines long. But risk-based approach. Look at the assets which have more of a risk to your organization, more of a risk to your clients. And those are the ones which you certainly need to focus on. There may be other assets which are of a less criticality. So they should still be covered under your asset management, but they may not be given high focus. So typically what we'd look in as a minimum or an expectation rather than a minimum, anything which is holding customer information. So either databases, spreadsheets, physical records, they would be assets which require to be protected. Any physical records of staff, again, because of the nature of the information that they're holding, need to be protected. Perhaps you have CCTV monitoring in place. So there are usually legal requirements in place in various countries on how images can be retained. There may be requirements for the length of the duration of those images to be retained, controls as to how unauthorized people such as the police force may require access to images. So again, these are assets which need to be considered. And the bottom two are the obvious ones which we see regularly, the actual laptops themselves and people. So you need to look at your own organization. You need to determine what assets are of value to you and or your clients, and then manage the assets. That's all 27001 is looking for. So again, the risk. Now that you've identified your assets, the next element is then to look at, assess the risks of those assets. So what 27001 looks for is you to have a process. It requires you to have a process to be able to manage risk. And it breaks it down by saying you really want to identify the risks to those assets associated with the three key principles. So what would happen if there was a loss of confidentiality, integrity, or availability to these assets? That needs to be managed. It requires you to identify a risk owner. Now that could be an individual, it could be the person who's managing that in finance, who's managing the database, but the risk could quite easily just be the organization. But you do require to identify risk owners. It then asks you to follow common good risk management processes. So analyze the potential consequences. If the risk were actually to happen, what would the impact be? Make sure you have realistic controls in place. So review the likelihood and the occurrence, and that allows you to determine the level of risk. So anything on this screen is those of you who are familiar with risk management, there should be nothing displayed which is new. And as I said earlier, the standard itself doesn't tell you how to do it. These are just the areas in the process it's expecting you to do. And this is good business practice. This is traditional risk management. So review the likelihood of the occurrence, determine the level of risk, then compare the risk to the criteria, the methodology you have, and then implement controls, manage the risk. Sometimes threats and vulnerabilities get confusing. Threats, as I'm trying to show on this slide here, are primarily the areas by which you could be at risk. So organizations may have a threat based on fire, flood, loss of power, perhaps theft and vandalism, access by unauthorized people. These are the threats. And once you identify your threats, then what ISO 27001 will ask you to do is then just look at each threat and determine how vulnerable are you to that threat. So fire, perhaps fire is a big threat and you are highly vulnerable because you still maintain lots of paper hard copies. So if you have a lot of paper records and you do not have adequate backups, you're very vulnerable to fire and your risk is greater because you have no backup. But flood, you may be located in the top of a hill. So flood is not a significant risk to yourself. It's still a threat. There is still a potential for flood. But from your position, based on where you are and what you are doing, that may not be the biggest vulnerability. So we expect you to identify the threats from a large list of reasons. And then for each threat, you look at your own organization and determine how vulnerable are we. So on the right-hand side, if we feel that perhaps flood may be an issue, in what manner? Is it because we have cabling which is sitting on the ground? So if we were to then raise that cabling above ground level, put it in trunking at roof level, would that reduce the likelihood of flood impacting us? Would the flood through the cabling provide us with denial of service? Other vulnerabilities, as shown there, password management. So a very weak password management, not changing passwords fairly regularly, can be a vulnerability. But if you have a regular process which is going to change it, say every 30 days, every 60 days, and you're enforcing an 8, 10, 12 string password policy, then you're less vulnerable than someone who's only allowing 4-letter, 6-character passwords. So the list on the left, the right-hand side, sorry, of vulnerabilities, each of those listed there is the subject of an Annex A control. So the standard is starting to build itself around what are common vulnerabilities from an information security perspective with an organization, and are we dressed? Are we fixed? So risk treatment, fairly obvious, fairly straightforward, just maintaining the same approach. Follow the hierarchy. Best practice is to avoid the risk by deciding not to start and continue with that element which gives rise. But if we cannot avoid it, we have to accept it, we then need to look at the risk itself. Can we remove the source? Can we change the likelihood? Can we impact the consequence? So these are all traditional risk management hierarchy, which ISO 27001 applies. Process, fairly simple. Identify the asset, identify the threat, identify the vulnerability, and then treat the risk. Potential challenges. Well, the cost of putting malware prevention into place, network security, being able to identify your network and defend the perimeter, educating users, a key factor to make sure that if people understand what's an issue, they will make sure to the best of their ability that it doesn't happen. Have a robust incident management process, being aware of physical and logical access rights, controls over removable media. These are all elements which in any organization can be a challenge. They can be time consuming, they can be expensive, but they are adequate controls to mitigate the risk. So you need to determine your risk appetite. You need to make sure that cyber risk is a priority for your organization. Make sure it's discussed at board level. Get the involvement from the top down. Produce risk management policies and make sure that any control which is covered within 27001, which applies to you, is managed. So it is better to be safe than sorry. Don't wait until things happen. 27001 expects you to be proactive. So all the monitoring that's built into the standard is to be able to make you identify risks and potential risks and then manage it before it becomes a concern. And what brings this all together? The 27001 standard. So just to finish off, make sure you train your staff, make them aware of the security risks, make sure you comply and deploy the controls from 27001 that applies. Do you know how secure your information is? Is cybersecurity actually on the agenda at your board, at your management meetings, at your organizational meetings? Is it visible at the highest level? Various courses which are available to organizations, individuals to fully develop more of a knowledge on the 27001. So there's one-day appreciation courses, there's internal auditor courses which will teach you and train you how to monitor yourself through the audit process. And there's other training which is available through the regulatory requirements. So that's the end of my my presentation. So there's a question and answer session just now. Any questions which we are unable to answer during the presentation will certainly be followed up by myself after today's webinar is completed. I will receive a list of all questions and I will then respond to you through our salespeople. So can I lead up to yourself? Is there any questions that anyone has based on the web session so far? Well, I'm not showing any on my screen. So if that is the case and no one has any other questions at this moment in time, as I said, any questions which are put forward will certainly be passed on to myself. I will then respond in due course back to each individual on their concerns and their questions. So if there's no other questions at this time, I will draw the presentation to an end. So once this presentation finishes, you will be issued with a short survey, 3 or 4 questions, which would like you to fill in. So the survey will appear just after the webinar finishes. So we'd ask you to complete it as honestly as possible to give us some positive feedback on it. And then any issues coming out of that, we will take on board and address. So all it takes for me to do now is just thank everyone who was listening to this presentation. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it stimulating. I hope I have answered some of the questions that you may have had coming into the web session. But if there's anything else that we can assist you in your journey down the information security pathway, certainly feel free to give the information back on the survey or through questions that we will address in due course. Okay, well in that case I would like to thank, and I will just call this web session to an end. So thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.